And what do you know about Solomon from the Bible? Wisest king.
He asked God for wisdom to be able to lead the people.
Mm-hmm.
He was the son of David.
Yes, God gave him that wisdom. God was impressed with that request. And so God not only gave him wisdom, he gave him wealth. He blessed him tremendously. So everything's going really well. In fact, it seems during the reign of Solomon that the nation of Israel is at its optimum peak in terms of financial prosperity. And then last week in chapter 10, somebody comes to visit Solomon, and things start to go downhill. You remember who that is? The Queen of Sheba. Of course, Sheba, if you look on a map, is originally in the southern Arabia area. If you look on a map today where the country of Yemen is, that's where Sheba, ancient Sheba, would have been. So she travels about 1,000 miles to come to see Solomon because she's heard all these stories about him, his wealth, how wise he is, and she wants to see for herself. So, as we left off at the end of chapter 10 last week, we get a picture of Solomon's wealth. And that takes us to chapter 11 today. And this is where the beginning of the end takes place for Solomon. Notice the... That's what we're going to be reading.
This is not the first time.
I know, but you know, every time that goes off, it's reading the Bible, Galen.
Yes,
That's a
it is.
good thing, right?
Yes, it is.
It's all good.
I'll get it down here.
So, while Galen is trying to silence the Word of God,
Winnie was holding it.
it's all good. Don't worry about it.
There we go. Sorry about that.
So Solomon is the wisest person that ever lived, but we're going to see that even the wisest person who ever lived can make mistakes. And Solomon's going to make some big mistakes that are going to lead to his downfall. Notice how chapter 11 begins. Now Solomon loved many foreign women. All right. Here's how the first three verses read. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, remember he had married Pharaoh's daughter. He built her a palace. We read about that. He married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the cities. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel, you must not marry them because they will turn your hearts to their gods. Yet Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. And in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So, God had given the people of Israel, you go back to the time of Joshua, these instructions. I don't want you to intermarry with these other foreign women. And it wasn't because they were foreign women, it was because they worshipped other gods. And God knew that would turn the hearts of his people away from him. And so he counseled against that. He told Solomon not to do that. And Solomon did it anyway. You ever done something like that? You ever had someone say, hey, this is really not a good idea, you shouldn't do it, and you're like, I'm going to do it anyway. That's what Solomon does here, and he's going to pay a steep price for it. Because the whole reason why God says this has nothing to do with race. It has to do with they will turn your hearts to their gods. That's why. So Solomon had how many wives?
700.
Goodness. What in the world? 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Yeah.
How in the world do you keep up with that many people? Yeah, there's only 365 days in the year. I'll see you. We'll have dinner next year. But notice what happens here. Would someone read verses 4 through 6?
For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, of the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not fully follow the Lord as did his father David. Is that it?
Yes, perfect. So, there's more description given of what happens to Solomon in his old age, we're told. So Solomon is getting up here in age, and his heart is being turned away from God. He is not following in the path of his father David. Now, we know David wasn't perfect. Of course, his sins are out there for everybody to read. But yet David had a heart for the Lord, and he kept going back to the Lord and turning to the Lord. And that's what Solomon initially does. But then he does something that God tells him not to. God says, hey, if you do this, here's what's going to happen. Solomon doesn't listen, and Solomon's heart is turned away from God. So he leaves the path that his father David had set for him. It says here, verse 5, he worshiped Ashtoreth. Now, probably the most well-known false god that we read about in the Old Testament was the god of Baal. Ashtoreth is the female equivalent to Baal. Okay? We read about Asherah poles that were built. I think King Hezekiah destroys, no, not Hezekiah, Josiah destroys those. So, this is one of the gods. Another god that's mentioned here is the god Moloch. But I think you had, what did yours say, Anna?
Milcom.
Yeah, same different, yeah, same God, different name. And the text says this was the detestable god of the Ammonites. When you look through ancient pagan religions, some of them have some very disturbing elements. And sometimes what makes those so disturbing is child sacrifice. And the worship of Moloch was one of those. And one of the sins of the Israelites is they participated in this worship. Sometimes an altar to Moloch would be built, a statue, if you will, with outstretched arms.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be hollow in the inside where they could build a fire. And the sacrifice would be placing a child on the outstretched arms, and the child would burn to death. There's a reason why God says don't go down this road. God is not in favor of child sacrifice. And so that was the god Moloch, and that's why that god is referred to by the author of 1 Kings as being detestable.
Didn't Moloch, didn't the arms like move up to its mouth too sometimes, and it put it in its mouth sometimes? I thought that's what.
Maybe I hadn't heard that before.
I think
but
that's what a preacher said on YouTube. He did a study on. I did a study on that, and he said that the arms would be like mechanical sometimes, and they would put it in. And the fire would be inside of it, so that means it ate it and it
really
burned it in like that.
Huh.
That's what.
That maybe I hadn't heard that.
Yeah.
But yeah, detestable any way you look at it.
Yeah.
But notice verse 8. Solomon built shrines for these gods. He built shrines for these women to sacrifice to their gods. Now notice verse 9, God's response. Let's look at, would someone read verses 9 through 13?
And the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your mind, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Keep going.
That's good.
Okay.
So God had appeared to Solomon twice. Have you ever thought, or maybe heard someone say, if God would just speak to me, I'd believe. I'd be good to go. God spoke to Solomon twice, and notice what's happening right here. Sometimes even having God speak to us directly won't change what we choose to do. You remember there's a story that Jesus told in the Gospel of Luke. There were these two individuals. There was a very wealthy man, and there was a poor beggar named Lazarus. And Lazarus used to sit outside, and he would beg. because that's the only way you could ever get any kind of money. Back then, they didn't have, for people with any kind of disabilities or whatever, they didn't have treatment places. They didn't have any kind of help or assistance in first century Roman Empire. So Lazarus would have to beg. And there was a rich man who would pass him every day. And the rich man never, ever acknowledged Lazarus. Well, Lazarus dies and the rich man dies. And Jesus says, when they die, the rich man winds up in a place of torment. He's suffering, he's in pain. And there's this great chasm, and he looks across the way and he sees Lazarus the beggar, and Lazarus is being comforted. And Lazarus has everything that he needs. It's almost the tables have been turned story. In life, it was this, in their physical life, it was this way. Now, after death, it's much different. But the rich man, realizing that he's just made the biggest mistake of his life, he cries out and he says, please send Moses or one of the prophets. I've got brothers. And if someone came back from the dead and told them, then they would repent. They would change their ways. And the response is given, no, even if someone from the dead, they won't change their ways. Sometimes we say, if I would just have this, then I'd change my ways. But really, that doesn't always change our hearts. Solomon had heard from God twice. God had blessed him tremendously, right? Given him everything he ever wanted. Have you ever said, if I just had $1 million, all the good that I would do? I'll tell you, one of the most sobering things to do is Google this sometime. Google Powerball winners and see what happened to their lives afterwards. Most of their lives are in shambles.
Yeah.
So, it's enticing, right? I mean, we're sitting here now. How many of us are saying, oh yeah, well, I bet I could handle $1 million. I could be okay. But that's tough. So God becomes angry with Solomon. He had appeared to him twice. He had blessed him. He'd given him wisdom, blessed him with all these other things. And Solomon's sin is a testament to his ingratitude. And it's a waste of his special privilege. You ever heard someone say, oh, this person, he just had so much potential. She just had so much potential. What happened? What happened to him? That's Solomon. Solomon had so much potential. And in the end, he chooses women over that potential.
That really kind of, it shocked me when I was at the program and I heard that. I mean, I was like reading the book of Proverbs. We read it every day. And then I heard about that. I was like, so he wrote this whole part of this Bible right here, and then he just had sex with all these women, and then they turned him into looking at their gods and stuff. And yeah, and I was like, wow.
Yeah, it's a very sobering story. And in fact, I don't think it was always that way with Solomon. He's attributed to writing the Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs. And that is a love letter to one woman. So at some point, Solomon wasn't always like this. But when God said, hey, don't go down this road because here's what's going to happen, Solomon thought he was strong enough to resist, and he wasn't. So, here's what God's going to do. In verse 11, he says to Solomon, since you've not kept my commandment, since you've disobeyed my decrees, what is he going to tear away from Solomon? The kingdom. The kingdom that he promised David, that your son will carry on this kingdom. But the condition was that Solomon obey and follow the Lord. Now Solomon has chosen not to do that. And God says, I'm going to tear the kingdom away from you. I'm going to give it to one of your servants. But notice verse 12. Because of his relationship with David, he says, I won't do this until when? Right. I'm not going to do this in your lifetime. For the sake of your father David, I will not do this while you're still alive. And then verse 13, he says, even then I will not take away the entire kingdom. I will let him, your son, be king of one tribe for the sake of David. And you know, after the time of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel are going to split into two kingdoms. You're going to have the northern kingdom, and you're going to have the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is going to be comprised of 2 tribes. The southern kingdom is going to be comprised of 10 tribes. Or did I get that right? No, that's right. I think that's right. All right. It's Sunday night. So let's look at what else God does here. Have you ever thought that God would raise up enemies for you? People to oppose you? That's what he does for Solomon. So let's look at what he does. Would someone read verses 14? Oh, this is kind of long. Let's go 14 through 22. Would anybody read those verses?
Then the Lord raised up an adversary to Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the royal line of Edom. For it came about when David was in Eden, and Joab the commander of the army had gone up to bury the slain, and had struck down every male in Eden. For Joab and all Israel stayed there 6 months, until he had cut off every male in Eden. That Hadad fled to Egypt, he and certain Edomites of his father's servants with him, while Hadad was a young boy. And they arose from Midian and came to Paran, and they took men with them from Paran and came to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave him a house and assigned him food and gave him land. Now Hadad found great favor before Pharaoh, so that he gave him in marriage the sister of his own wife, the sister of Talpenes, the queen. And the sister of Talpenes bore his son Geneva. Why did I pick these verses? Weaned in Pharaoh's house, and Genevieve was in Pharaoh's house among the sons of Pharaoh. But then Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers, and that Joab, the commander of the army, was dead. Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Send me away, that I may go to my own country." Then Pharaoh said to him, "But what have you lacked with me? And behold, you are seeking to go to your own country?" And he answered, "Nothing. Nevertheless, you must surely let me go."
Okay. So God's going to raise up 2 foreign adversaries to Solomon. The first one is Hadad the Edomite. Okay. The Edomites, the country of Edom, was descended from what person? Esau. Esau was the brother of Jacob. And they had a major falling out. What was it over?
Yeah, the
birthright.
birthright.
Yeah, Jacob was deceptive, right? He fooled their father Jacob, or fooled their father Isaac. All right, and but he made a deal with Esau before Esau had come in. Esau was starving, and Jacob had made some food and said, "Hey, I'll give this to you if you give me your birthright." And Esau had made a raw deal, and then they didn't tell their father about it, and then Jacob went in and deceived their father and stole Esau's birthright, because Esau was the oldest. He stole what Esau should have had. And so this created major rift. Do you ever have family rift? Yeah. Anybody that has a family, I can think of a time where family didn't get along too well. So Jacob and Esau really didn't get along for a long time. And their children, they passed that on to their children. And so you have the nation of Israel coming through Jacob, and you had the Edomites coming through Esau, and they remained enemies for quite some time. And it all started because 2 brothers they had a falling out. It's kind of like, remember in American history, the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? Generations later, why are we even fighting? And family members don't even know, because it started with one incident that wasn't dealt with, and it grew, and that hate was spread. See, hate is something that's spread, and it's passed on from generation to generation. And that's what happens here. So Hadad is from Edomite, descended from Esau, enemies of the Israelites. And we get some history here about the time when David had defeated them, and Hadad had escaped with some of his father's officials. And he found refuge in Egypt. Pharaoh took him in. What's the relationship with Egypt and the Israelites? Yeah, they had kept him enslaved for 400 years. So there's a history there as well. Pharaoh had taken him in, had allowed him to live there. Even he had was given a wife, uh, and he has a son. But when he hears that David has died, he says, I want to leave. I want to go back to my country." So he's going back. It seems that God's going to use him to cause Solomon trouble. We're never told in the Bible exactly what trouble he causes Solomon, but that he causes Solomon trouble. But isn't it interesting? He's fearful of David, but he's not fearful of Solomon. And when he finds out that David is dead, he's like, I want to go back. Solomon doesn't really deter him, not like David. So, let's go down to the next adversary that God raises up against Solomon. After Janet reading that last one, nobody may volunteer to read this one. Would someone read verses 23 through 25?
I'll read it.
Okay.
And God raised up against Solomon another adversary, Rezon, son of Eladah, who had fled from his master. Hadadizzer, king of Zobah, he gathered men around him and became the leader of a band of rebels when David destroyed the forces of Zobah. The rebels went to Damascus, where they settled and took control. Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. So Rezon ruled in Aram and was hostile toward Israel.
Okay. Good job. There's some big words there. So we got another guy come up. And again, there's a history there going back to David and people that David had fought against. Now he's going to come back now that David's gone, and he's going to cause trouble to Solomon. And notice that God allows this to happen, and it goes back to the first few verses of chapter 11 because Solomon blatantly disobeyed what God told him. And so God is going to allow these adversaries to come up against him. But that's not all of them, because among his own officials an enemy is going to arise. This one's name is Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He comes from the town of Zerada in Ephraim. Ephraim was whose son? Ephraim and Manasseh were brothers, and they were born to who?
Joseph.
Yes! That's why you're going to be on Jeopardy. We're sending you to Jeopardy. If they ever have a Bible tournament, all right, Joey, we're going to take up a collection. Joey's going to go to Jeopardy, all right? He was one of Joseph's sons, and so that's where the nation of Ephraim comes from, the son of Joseph. So now we get the story of Jeroboam's rebellion. Now, the difference in Jeroboam and the first two guys that were mentioned, Hadad and Rezon are foreigners. Jeroboam's an Israelite. That kind of changes things, doesn't it? When it's one of your own people. That's what Solomon's going to deal with. So let's look at the story here of his rebellion. Solomon, we got to go back in time a little bit. Solomon is rebuilding terraces, repairing walls of the city. And you have this young man named Jeroboam. And we get a picture of a man who is full of potential, a capable man. Solomon notices how industrious he is. And so he puts him in charge of the labor force from Ephraim and Manasseh. He gives him a position of recognition. He gives him authority. He gives him responsibility, because Solomon says, here is somebody that has a ton of potential. He's doing great, and I want to recognize this. So let's look and see what happens. Would someone read verses 29 through 33?
I'll read it.
Okay.
About the time Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shalom, met him on the way wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Elijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Shamash, the god of Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and laws, as David, Solomon's father, did."
Okay, so here's the scene. We have a picture of Jeroboam, a really, seems like a very impressive young man. Solomon has put him in charge of a labor force. He's leaving the city, and he's approached by a prophet named Ahijah. And Ahijah sees that Jeroboam's wearing a new cloak, right? Because he just got put into this wonderful position. And so what do we do sometimes? Hey, I got a new job, I've got to have new clothes. So he's got a new cloak. And as they're leaving, it's just the two of them walking along, and Ahijah takes the cloak and he rips it into 10 pieces. And he says, this is what God is going to do to the kingdom that Solomon is ruling over. He's going to tear it apart. And 10 of these 10 pieces will be yours. 10 of the tribes will go to you. But for the sake of his father David, not all the tribes will be taken from Solomon. And notice verse 33, we're given the reason for all of this. Because Solomon has forsaken God, he has embraced these other gods, he's not followed the ways of God as his father did. So I want you to get this picture here. Israel, from an economic, military, this is their zenith, historically speaking. They have never been this wealthy, they've never been this powerful, and it all is going to come crashing down like that. God is taking the kingdom away from Solomon. Jeroboam is going to be one of his instruments. Notice in verse 34. Again, he says, I won't take the whole kingdom away from Solomon because of his father David. And Solomon will be allowed to reign for the rest of his life. But from his son, I will take the kingdom away, and I will give 10 of these tribes to you, Jeroboam. Jeroboam is going to be placed on a throne. And so, as we read this text, and God doing this because of Solomon's sin, Solomon evidently finds out about this because in verse 40 it says he tries to kill Jeroboam. And where does Jeroboam flee? Egypt. He goes to Egypt. He finds refuge in the country of Egypt, protection. And so he escapes Solomon's hands. So what do you think about all of this? Does Solomon deserve this?
Yeah, turned away.
I think what happened to all his wisdom?
He was corrupted. He was corrupted by his own flesh, and the flesh man fights the spirit man all the time, and he was sleeping with way too many women and lusting after way too many flesh, and their gods were strong through their vessels like that, and it corrupted his spirit.
Yeah, have you ever known somebody that maybe started dating someone and you're like, they totally changed? What is wrong with them? Well, sometimes our heads get messed with and we don't think straight, and I think that's what happens to Solomon here. And there's another factor here too, I think, that sometimes we think too much of ourselves. And Solomon could look around at this kingdom that he'd been given from his father David, a kingdom that he'd made even better economically, and think, We're the most powerful nation on earth. What can happen to us? And God has a reminder to nations who get arrogant like that. He throughout history, he brings those nations down to their knees. So that's why it's important for us to continue to seek the Lord here in our nation. Because our nation is not dependent on our military might, is not dependent on our economic prosperity. Nations rise and fall through the Lord. So we want to make sure that we seek the face of the Lord and we do what honors God. Y'all are quiet tonight. Everybody okay? All right. We'll do a little jig. Don't put that on Facebook. All right, so let's go on here. Verse 41, there's a little conclusion here. The rest of the events of in Solomon's reign, all his deeds, his wisdom, are recorded where?
The Acts of Solomon.
Yes. Who's got a copy of that book? I would really like to read a copy of that book. Don't you? I mean, it's mentioned here, and we don't even have a copy of it. So then we read that Solomon dies. He ruled in Jerusalem for how many years? 40 years. That's a long time. If you think about it, the way our system is set up, we have a president every 4 years, and then we have another election, and if that president wins re-election, the most a president can serve is 8 years. Except one president served for much longer than that. Who was that? Roosevelt, and that's why we have the 2-term rule now, right? But 40 years is a long time for one person to reign. Can you imagine having one president for 40 years?
No.
So,
But we've got senators that do.
yeah,
True.
yeah. Well said. Right. So Solomon dies. He's buried in the city of David, and who becomes king in his place? Rehoboam, his son. Now, this is a little ominous because God has already said that he's going to rip the kingdom from Solomon's son. This is the son. Rehoboam is going to inherit a kingdom that is soon going to be destroyed because of Jeroboam. All right, any thoughts up to this point?
Well, whenever God gives you something, if you're disobedient to what God gives you, whatever God gives you comes from His Spirit. And whenever you sin, whenever you do, like Solomon was sleeping with a whole lot of women and not listening to God, and that was separating him from hearing God's Spirit and the power of God's Spirit through him. So that's how he was able to be so corrupted, and that's how we're able to be so corrupted whenever we listen to our self other than what God tells us to do.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. The good news is that we can always come back to God. And that's something that Solomon didn't learn from his father David. David committed some horrible sins. But David repented and turned back to God. He kept going back to God. He trusted God enough. And Solomon didn't learn that kind of repentance. So whenever we find ourselves and we've made a decision, we're like, how in the world could I have done that? Maybe we listen to our desires or whatever. The message that we have from the Bible is that we can come back to God. And that's what David teaches us. And it's sad that Solomon did not learn that. So, Joey, you got a song to sing us out of here tonight?
Our closing songs can be song number 616. Song number 616. I've done this one in a while, so I'll give
Go home by the way of the cross. There's no other way but this. I shall live in sight of the gates of life if the way of the cross
I miss. The cross leads home. The way of the cross leads home. It is to know as I onward go. The way of the cross leads home.
I must needs go on in the blood-sprinkled way,
The path that the Savior's trod.
if I ever climb to the heights above, where the soul is at home
With God. The way of the cross leads home. The way of the cross leads home.
It is
Sweet to know as I onward go. The way of the cross leads home.
Then I bid farewell to the way of the world, to walk in it evermore.
For the Lord says, come, and I seek my home, where he waits at the open door. The way of the cross leads home. The way of the cross leads home. It is sweet to know as onward go. The way of the cross leads home. Hallelujah.
We'll have our closing prayer now. Father, again, we thank you for this Lord's Day. We thank you for a time of worship before you, to sing songs of praise to your name, to lift up your name, and to share from your word, and again, learn the ways that we must follow you and always go in the direction that you have for us, and that you set forth in your word, so that we can always have the blessings that you've given us so much. And we thank you for that. As we thank you for our church, and we thank you for all our elders and our deacons and our ministry leaders and all the things that help us here. We thank you for going with us, and we ask you to be with each of us as we go out and bring us back again. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
In Jesus' name.